Welcome back to The Look and Sound of Leadership, an ongoing series of executive coaching tips designed to help you be perceived in the workplace the way you want to be perceived. I'm Tom Henschel, your executive coach, and today we're talking about executive presence. Melinda, a fellow coach, called asking if I could help with a client of hers. The topic, she said, was executive presence. Knowing I've been talking with my own clients about executive presence for years, she said, I went to your podcast but couldn't find anything specifically on executive presence. You couldn't? I was surprised. That seems like an oversight, doesn't it? Doesn't it? She laughed. Anyway, it made a good excuse to call you. She launched into her story. This client is named Ozma. She's a rising star at a company where I've been coaching for years. I remember when she showed up there. She made an impression. Smart, articulate, unflappable, but she keeps hearing that she needs more executive presence. She and I have talked about confidence, but I don't know if confidence is really the issue. She seems fairly confident. And about how old is she, I asked. Well, I don't think she's 30 yet. You said she's unflappable. What does that mean? She is one cool customer. I sat in on a meeting where she made a presentation. At one point, there was a flurry of questions from senior people, probably 10 in a row. It wasn't hostile. People were engaged, calling out one question after another. And she was cool as a cucumber. I don't think I could have done that at her age. Oh, she sounds great, I said. So if it's not about confidence, what do you think would give her more executive presence? She paused, and then slowly, she's not terribly expressive, not monotone exactly, but there's just not a lot of variety in her voice, or her face for that matter. Could that be an executive presence issue? Oh, sure, I said. When people are hard to listen to for whatever reason, maybe they've got a screechy voice, or they're just horribly dull, they're probably not going to display a lot of executive presence. She asked, how are you defining executive presence? Well, I'm happy to tell you my definition, but it's much more important that you and Ozma know what the definition is there, with the people who are giving the feedback. How do they define executive presence? She said, is the definition really going to change that much from place to place? Well, I think so. I think executive presence at a defense contractor looks different from executive presence at a lifestyle company. Really? She said. Aren't the people we recognize as having executive presence going to share a lot of qualities no matter what? Oh, I said. Yeah, of course. I went down the rabbit hole of behaviors, but yes, you are right. I do say that people with executive presence share 3 qualities. I talk about them as 3 pillars. Oh, there are 3 pillars, she said. Great. I know you love models, I said. She said, give them to me. Well, let me give you the first 2. They go together. They're paired up. Okay, she said, settling in. What are they? Confidence and humility. I love that, she said, sotto voce, as she wrote. I love the tension of those words together. Tension how, I asked. Well, on the one hand, we want our leaders to be confident, right? But not too confident. We don't want pigheads who never listen to anyone. We don't want arrogance. So, add in some humility. Show a willingness to listen, to learn, to be wrong. But not too much humility, right? We don't want someone who can't take a stand. We don't want timidity, which brings us back to confident but not too confident. It is a balancing act, I agreed. I first saw those words paired up in Crucial Conversations. Love that book, she said. Paired up like that, they struck me so strongly that they became the balancing pillars in my definition of executive presence. And the challenge, she said, is to not be too heavily weighted on one side or the other, right? I don't think Ozma is overbalanced with humility, not like some of my young female clients. Are you seeing a lot of young women who are overly humble? I asked. A lot, no, but I'm never surprised when I meet a young woman who has more humility than confidence. What about the opposite? I asked. Are your male clients overbalanced with confidence? Maybe. Oh, I'd have to think about that, she said. And then she asked, what about you? Does it break down along gender lines for you? Yeah, I probably talk about confidence with more women than men. Sounds like we're in the same boat, she said. So, What's the third pillar? I said, altitude. She asked, altitude like strategic thinking altitude? Maybe, yeah, but I think of altitude more holistically than that. I think altitude affects everything you do at work. It affects how you think about the business. It affects how you prioritize your work. It affects how you communicate. It affects what information you pay attention to. This is interesting, she said. Altitude has never been on my radar. I have no idea if this is something Ozma needs or not. What should I be listening for? I listen for altitude when people talk about their work. What is their default altitude? Microfocused, which is low altitude, or thinking broadly, which is high altitude? Well, I'm not certain about her altitude, Melinda said. But I do know she's not great at managing up. Could that be an altitude issue? It could, absolutely. If she's not managing up well, it might be that she can't think at her boss's altitude. Giving her the idea of altitude might be helpful for her. But aren't you asking for the impossible? Melinda asked. She's never worked at her boss's altitude. How could she think at that altitude? Can I give you an analogy? I asked. Sure, she said. Imagine using Google Earth. When you're doing your work, managing a million details, it's like Google Earth is clicked all the way in, so you can see property lines and streets and fences and patios. To do your work well, you have to be clicked in so you can see the details. You're at a low altitude, and that's appropriate. You with me? Yep, she said. Now think about your boss. If your boss is clicked in as far as you are, if she is seeing property lines and patios, she's never going to get her own work done. She has to be clicked out at a higher altitude to be effective, right? She has to be seeing whole neighborhoods, maybe whole cities. Right, said Melinda, but how would Ozma be able to click out like that? Well, there are 4 ideas you might give her, I said. First, make sure she really knows on a really deep level that higher altitudes exist. And not just her boss's altitude, but her boss's boss and the boss above that. She needs to remember all the time, every day, there's a bigger picture. One click away, there is no ceiling above her. Ooh, that could be depressing, said Melinda. Depressing? Why? I asked. Well, it might make her feel like she's a really small, meaningless dot on a giant map. I suppose. But consider the second piece, I said. What's that? Curiosity. Interest, a desire to be at a higher altitude. No one's condemned to stay clicked in. If you look up with curiosity, altitude can be empowering, not diminishing. Okay, said Melinda. So what's idea 3? Ask her why her details matter to her boss. Bosses don't want to know the details of your work, but they need to know why those details are important to their own work. Ozma should be asking herself all the time, how does what I do help what my boss is doing? She made a thoughtful sound. I remember a client of mine who was way too detail-oriented, clicked in way too far, to use your analogy. I used to ask him to think like the CEO. That helped him. Is that the sort of thing we're talking about? I said, think like a CEO? That's a great thought exercise. Oh, good, she said. So what's the 4th one? Relentless pursuit, I answered. Be active. Find mentors. Listen closely. Ask good questions. It's all fine and dandy to know that a higher altitude exists, but what meaning are you making about what you see? And don't trust yourself. As you say, she's never been at that altitude before. Find people who will be your guides. Ask for help. Melinda said, the interesting thing about asking for help, it really challenges you to show up with humility. You have to be willing to admit there are things you don't know. And, I chimed in, do it with confidence. She went on, a lot of my clients struggle when it comes to asking for help. They've made a false equivalency that says needing help is the same thing as being weak, which of course is not true. I gave a chuckle, although I do make that equivalency myself sometimes. She chuckled, yeah, me too sometimes. There was a pause as we both thought about what had been said. After a moment, Melinda said, this whole altitude thing is completely new to me. Is there anything else I should know? I gave it a thought and then said, altitude isn't fixed. Altitude needs flexibility in thinking and in communicating. You need to scan for altitude all the time and then adjust accordingly. She said, don't talk to the board of directors the way you talk with a summer intern, right? Right, I said. Or vice versa, because altitude isn't only up. You need to be able to click down, too. That's helpful, she said. And then, will you go back to that whole thing about different presence at different companies? I said, I think the three pillars are constant, but the behaviors that exemplify the pillars can be different from company to company, or even from one group to another. I mean, one group might value conciseness and speed of thought. Another group might value assertion, and so executive presence would look different. The pillars don't change, but the behaviors might. I think Ozma might need some behaviors to make her more expressive, said Melinda. Months later, Melinda reported back to me that yes, expressive behaviors, along with discussions about the pillars confidence, humility, and altitude, helped Ozma develop her executive presence, which of course is the look and sound of leadership. Executive presence. The phrase executive presence is at the very core of my work. I would say that well over 50% of the coaching that I'm asked to do involves executive presence in one way or another. For me, executive presence is a big, broad concept like influence or communication. And because it is so big, there are many ways you can think about it. Today, I gave you three pillars, but come on, that's just one way to slice and dice it. Years ago, I actually used to talk about executive presence quite differently. I used the language from this great research paper by a woman named Sylvia Ann Hewitt at the Center for Talent Innovation. So back in 2012, she and her team surveyed 4,000 leaders. And the only requisite was that they had to be college graduates working at large American corporations. And so they surveyed these 4,000 people about executive presence, and they came up with three characteristics. And theirs were not like mine, like three equal pillars. Theirs were three wedges of a pie, and every wedge was incredibly different in size. It started with a teeny little wedge called appearance, and that was about 5%. And then there was a 25% wedge called communication. And the entire rest of the pie was called gravitas. And gravitas had 6 behaviors attached to it. And for years, I talked about executive presence using that framework of appearance, communication, and gravitas. I actually did an episode called Gravitas, and I did 2 other episodes that were two of the behaviors that made up gravitas in that research paper. Those 2 episodes were emotional intelligence and showing teeth. And look, my point here is there's lots of ways to think about executive presence. I want to give you 2 more. Before I do, I want to express my thanks to all of you. Since the Ask the Coaches inaugural episode launched last month with Mindy Dana, some of you have sent some emails with great questions. Thank you. Please keep those coming. Mindy and I will do another episode in the spring. Let us know what's on your mind. How can we help you? I also send out special thanks and gratitude to the folks who make the extra effort to post reviews in iTunes. Thank you. An independent podcast like this really just can't exist without that show of support. I am terribly grateful to the hundreds of you who have already posted reviews. And this month, 3 new folks get added to that gratitude list. They are from the UK, Mrs. Rogers, from the United States, Dollars and Rays, and Malish D&D MD Dues. Thanks to each of you. Thanks for posting that review. And thank you, by the way, for what you wrote. I really appreciated reading your comments. Thank you. Okay, 2 final ideas about executive presence. 1, this whole idea about behaviors. Look, I don't know what executive presence looks like where you work, but I hope you will start looking around and naming it. And it would be great, I think, if you saw 2 people who display executive presence differently. That would be great, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be instructive? Or maybe, maybe there's someone who is the antithesis of executive presence, and that's really great. Watch and learn what not to do. My point is, start paying attention. Look around. If you want to start working on your own behaviors, in this episode, I mentioned 4 that I think are pretty fail-safe, meaning that I think they will work pretty well for executive presence in any workplace. The 4 behaviors are speed of thought, conciseness, which is not the same thing, by the way, expressiveness, and being easy to listen to. Any of those would be great behaviors to start your executive presence development. That's idea number 1. Here's idea number 2. I want to give clarity to what I mean by humility. Humility is not self-doubt. It's not the absence of confidence. Quite the contrary, right? I'm suggesting that executive presence needs to have humility and confidence. So what does humility look like? I think it looks like the leader who can confidently make a recommendation and then say, "What do you think?" And then the leader does not speak again for a long time. The leader is willing to listen. The leader is willing to learn. There's no need to defend. And the leader genuinely considers the ideas of others. That's humility. And when I see it, I find it compelling. If the idea of executive presence interests you, oh boy, there are many ways you can dive down this rabbit hole. One is to go to the archive and use the filter called executive presence. You'll find lots of tips in there for you. You can find the archive with just one click. Go to the Essential Communications website. It's essentialcomm.com. It's essentialcomm with 2 M's.com. Then just click the podcast button or click the coaching tips button. Either one takes you to the archive. Every episode from over 10 years, it's available right there. Go for it. 4 specific episodes you might search for are Conquering Fear, Inhabiting Executive Presence, Short Sounds Confident, and The Voice of Authority. And I already mentioned 3 other episodes, Gravitas, Emotional Intelligence, and Showing Teeth. Good hunting. Enjoy yourself. Send us your questions. That's it from me. Until next time, I'm Tom Henschel. Thanks so much for listening.